It was a quiet weekend in early autumn when my friends and I decided to take a hiking trip through the dense woods of Green Hollow, a place known for its beauty and its unsettling atmosphere. The woods were untouched, the trees towering like silent sentinels, their branches thick and intertwined to form a canopy that blocked out most of the light. I had heard rumors about these woods, stories from locals who spoke of strange occurrences, but I dismissed them as nothing more than campfire tales. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway to escape the pressures of everyday life. We arrived at the edge of the woods in the late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The air had a cool crispness to it, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine. My friends, Tyler, Sarah, and Greg, were excited about the adventure ahead, laughing and chatting as we unloaded our gear and prepared to hike. "Race you to the clearing," Tyler shouted, already starting down the trail, his backpack bouncing as he jogged ahead. The path was narrow, with dense underbrush on either side. It wasn't long before the sounds of civilization, the hum of traffic, the distant chatter of other hikers faded into the background, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Despite the serenity, a strange sense of unease crept over me. The farther we ventured, the quieter it became. The only sound was the crunching of our boots on the gravel path, and yet, something felt wrong. "Hey, did you guys hear that?" Greg asked, his voice tense. We all stopped, straining our ears. For a moment, there was nothing, just the stillness of the woods. "I didn't hear anything," Sarah said, shaking her head. "You're just jumpy." But Greg was insistent. "No, seriously." There was something like a whisper. It came from the trees. Tyler laughed it off. "Probably just the wind. We're in the middle of a forest, remember?" We continued walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every few steps, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows, but there was nothing there. As the sun dipped lower, the sky turning shades of orange and purple, we reached a small clearing. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. We dropped our packs and started a fire, the crackling flames the only source of light in the growing darkness. That's when we heard it again, a faint whisper, carried by the wind. It was soft at first, like a murmur, just beyond the reach of our hearing. But then it grew louder, almost as if someone was standing just at the edge of the clearing. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Everyone fell silent, straining to listen. The wind had stopped, and all that remained was the eerie sound of whispering voices. "It's coming from over there," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she pointed toward the trees at the far end of the clearing. "Do you see something moving?" I turned to look, my heart skipping a beat. Between the trees, I saw something flicker. A shadow, tall and thin, shifting as though it were a part of the darkness itself. Without a word, we all stood and took a step back toward the fire. The whispering continued, growing louder with every passing second, until it felt as though it was coming from every direction. "Okay, this is creeping me out," Greg muttered. "We need to leave," I agreed. My gut told me something wasn't right. As we began to gather our things, the whispers suddenly stopped. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with an unsettling silence. "Did anyone else see that?" Tyler asked, his voice low. We all turned toward him, and my blood ran cold. In the shadows near the edge of the clearing, a figure stood motionless. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its features were hidden in the darkness. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching us. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly raised one hand, pointing toward us. My heart pounded in my chest. We had to leave, now. We grabbed our packs and bolted toward the path, but the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, blocking our way. The sound of the whispering followed us, growing louder and louder, until it felt as though the very air was thick with voices, all whispering our names, urging us to stay. We stumbled down the trail, panicked and out of breath, but the figure was still there, following us from the shadows. We ran faster, the path now seeming endless, but every time we looked back, the figure was just behind us, always just out of reach. When we finally made it back to the car, gasping for air, we looked around, but there was no sign of the figure. The forest was silent again, as though nothing had happened. As we drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those eyes watching us from the woods. None of us spoke for the rest of the drive, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We never spoke about that night again, but every time I pass by that stretch of road, I can't help but feel the weight of those whispering voices, calling me back to the woods, to the figure that still waits there, hidden in the shadows. It was late autumn when my family decided to spend the weekend at a cabin in the small town of Oak Ridge. The cabin had been in my mother's family for generations, tucked away on a quiet hill surrounded by dense woods. My parents, my younger brother James, and I made the long drive up on Friday evening, excited for a peaceful retreat from our busy lives. The cabin was charming but old, with creaky floors and dark wooden beams that gave it a rustic feel. My parents were in high spirits, and my brother, ever the troublemaker, was already plotting ways to sneak out and explore the woods alone. I, on the other hand, felt a strange tension in the air, a sense of unease that I couldn't explain. The first night was uneventful. We all sat around the fireplace, chatting and enjoying the warmth as the wind howled outside. As the night wore on, my parents retired to their room, and James and I decided to play cards in the living room before heading to bed. The house was silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind that made the walls creak. Around 2 a.m., as I was about to shuffle the cards for another round, I heard something. It was a soft tapping sound, like someone gently knocking on the window. I froze, staring at the glass, unsure of whether I'd imagined it. I leaned closer, straining to hear, but the tapping stopped just as suddenly as it had started. I glanced at James, who was fast asleep on the couch, oblivious to the noise. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just the wind, and went to bed. But as I lay there in the dark, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent, like someone was trying to get my attention. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced over at the window next to my bed. I couldn't see anything through the heavy curtains, but the sound continued soft, rhythmic, and persistent. I got out of bed slowly, my footsteps almost silent on the wooden floor. I approached the window, holding my breath as I peered through the curtains. There, standing just outside the window, was a figure, a shadow, tall and indistinct, standing motionless in the dark. I recoiled in fear, my heart racing as I backed away from the window. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at the glass. The tapping stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I rushed back to my bed, pulling the covers over my head, too terrified to sleep. My mind raced, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. The next morning, I told my parents about what had happened. They laughed it off, chalking it up to the wind and my overactive imagination. But when we went outside to grab some firewood, my heart sank. There, just below the window where I had seen the shadow, was a set of footprints in the freshly fallen snow. The prints were large, too large to belong to anyone in our family, and they led from the window to the edge of the woods before disappearing into the trees. We tried to dismiss it, telling ourselves it was probably some animal or even a local who had wandered by. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end whenever I walked past that window, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still watching us. That night, we kept the blinds closed and locked every door and window before going to bed. But I couldn't sleep. The tapping started again, this time from the back door. It was the same soft, persistent sound, like someone was knocking, but there was no one there when I looked. By the time the weekend was over, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us home from that cabin. Every time I passed a window, I would glance out, half expecting to see that shadow standing just beyond the glass. And to this day, I can't bring myself to go back to Oak Ridge, the memories of those nights still haunting me. In the summer of 2018, I took a solo road trip to clear my mind. I was in the middle of a particularly stressful year at work and needed time away to recharge. I mapped out a route through some quiet back roads in northern Nevada, a part of the country I'd never explored before. The idea was to drive for hours with no destination, just me, my car, and the open road. The first day was beautiful endless stretches of highway bordered by desert landscapes and mountains. I didn't pass many cars, and the isolation felt peaceful. By nightfall, I found a small motel off the highway to rest. The owner, an elderly woman, greeted me with a warm smile and handed me the key to a room at the back of the property. I thanked her and made my way to the room, eager to get some rest before continuing the next leg of my trip. I was in bed by 11 p.m., the sound of the desert wind gently whistling outside my window. I had just turned off the light when I heard a knock on the door. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone had the wrong room, but the knock came again, louder this time. I sat up, confused. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the old woman had seemed friendly enough when I checked in. I got out of bed, walked to the door, and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find a prankster or someone needing help, but the hallway was empty. No cars were parked nearby, and no one was in sight. I stepped outside to look around, but the parking lot was still. Shrugging it off as some late-night traveler, I returned to my room and locked the door. The next night, I left the motel earlier than usual, wanting to make up some time on the road. But as I was driving through the dark highway, something strange happened. My rearview mirror reflected the faint outline of a figure sitting in the back seat. I froze. My pulse raced as I whipped my head around to look behind me, but there was nothing there, just the empty seats. I quickly glanced back at the mirror. The figure was still there. My hands were shaking as I sped up, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow from the passing street lights. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the car. The next hour was a blur of panic and tension. Every time I glanced in the mirror, the figure remained. Finally, I pulled over at a rest stop, my heart hammering in my chest. I rushed out of the car, checking the back seat frantically, but again there was nothing there. Terrified and exhausted, I drove the rest of the way home with the unsettling feeling that someone had been watching me the entire time. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I will never drive down that road again. In the summer of 2019, my girlfriend, Emma, and I decided to take a road trip through the countryside. We had been planning it for months, eager to escape the city and experience something new. Our route was set small towns, back roads, and scenic views. It was going to be the perfect getaway. The first few days were everything we hoped for: quiet, peaceful, and free from the hustle of our daily lives. But on the fourth day of the trip, something changed. We were driving along a desolate stretch of highway, with only the occasional farmhouse dotting the horizon. The air was thick with heat, the kind of heat that seemed to linger and suffocate, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the hills. Emma was driving, and I was scrolling through my phone when I noticed a sign for a small town up ahead. We hadn't planned to stop there, but I suggested we pull over and grab some food. Emma agreed, and we took the exit onto a narrow, winding road that led us toward the town. As we drove deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, blocking out the last remnants of sunlight. It felt like we had entered another world. The air grew colder, the atmosphere heavy and still. We didn't speak much as Emma navigated the twisting road, the only sound the hum of the tires against the asphalt. When we finally reached the town, we were surprised to find it almost completely deserted. The streets were empty, and the buildings appeared old and weathered. There were no cars, no people, just an eerie silence. The only sign of life was a small diner on the corner, its neon sign flickering faintly. "Let's stop here," I suggested, feeling the odd sense that we had ventured too far into an unfamiliar place. Emma agreed, and we parked in front of the diner. As we entered, the bell above the door jingled, and the quiet hum of the air conditioning filled the room. The place was dimly lit, with only a few patrons scattered at the far tables. The waitress, an older woman with graying hair, greeted us with a polite smile, but said nothing else. We sat at the counter, and I noticed the worn, peeling wallpaper, the greasy tiles underfoot. The place felt like it hadn't been updated in decades. We ordered a couple of sandwiches, and as we waited, I absent-mindedly glanced into the large mirror behind the counter. The reflection of the room seemed normal at first, but then I noticed something odd. There was a figure standing at the far end of the diner, just behind the last table. I couldn't see their face clearly, but they were tall and dressed in dark clothes. Their presence was unnerving, like they didn't belong there. The strange thing was, no one else seemed to notice them. The other patrons were absorbed in their meals, and the waitress continued wiping down the counter. I blinked, certain that I had imagined it, but when I looked again, the figure was still there. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was like the figure was staring directly at me, even though its face was hidden in the shadows. My heart began to race, and I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. "Emma," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you see that person?" Emma looked over but saw nothing unusual. "What are you talking about?" she asked, looking at the empty corner of the room. There's no one there, but I was sure of what I had seen. The figure had been there, standing still, almost still. The longer I stared at it, the more unnatural it seemed. Just then, the waitress set our food down in front of us, and I forced myself to look away from the mirror. I tried to focus on the meal, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The figure wasn't in the reflection anymore, but the sense of unease was overwhelming. We ate quickly, both of us feeling the same uncomfortable tension in the air. When we finished, we stood up to leave, but as we passed by the mirror again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was now standing directly behind me in the reflection, inches from my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there. My mind raced. Was I going crazy? Had I imagined everything? We hurried out of the diner and into the car, but even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. The town seemed to stretch on forever, its empty streets and silent buildings pressing in on us. We didn't speak as we drove back to the highway, both of us lost in our own thoughts. That night, as we made camp in a small motel off the main road, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the reflection of that figure, standing just behind me, waiting. We left the town the next morning, but the memory of that diner, and the strange figure, still haunts me. I often wonder what we stumbled upon that night. Was it a ghost? Or something else, something darker, watching us from the shadows? My friend Brian and I decided to rent an old farmhouse for a weekend getaway in the fall of 2020. It had been a stressful year for both of us, and we were looking for a quiet, isolated place to relax and unwind. The farmhouse was located on a sprawling piece of land, surrounded by dense woods and fields. The moment we arrived, the house felt different. There was an odd, heavy atmosphere, as though the house itself was holding its breath. We spent the first day exploring the property, but the unease lingered. The house was massive, 2 stories, with an attic, several bedrooms, and long, narrow hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. We spent the evening in the living room, drinking beer and watching movies, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At around midnight, we decided to call it a night. Brian went to his room upstairs, and I stayed in the guest room on the main floor. As I settled into bed, the house grew unnervingly quiet. The wind had stopped, and there was no sound except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering. It came from above, slow, drawn-out words that I couldn't quite make out. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. "Brian," I called, but he didn't answer. The whispering continued, growing louder, more distinct, as though someone or something was right above me. I grabbed my phone and texted Brian, asking if he had heard anything, but there was no reply. The whispering was relentless, filling the room with a low, guttural tone that made my skin crawl. I felt as though I was being drawn into the sound, like it was calling to me. Without thinking, I got up and quietly made my way to the staircase. The whispering grew louder as I ascended the stairs, until it was almost deafening. When I reached the attic door, I froze. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a single word: my name. John. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I turned and ran back down the stairs, too scared to even glance at the attic door again. I locked myself in the guest room, my mind racing with questions. What had I heard? Who had spoken my name? And why did it feel like something was lurking in that attic, waiting? Brian came down in the morning, groggy and confused. He hadn't heard anything unusual. We packed up and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me from that attic, something that hadn't been there when we arrived. It was the middle of winter when I moved into an old apartment in a quiet part of town. I had just started a new job and was eager to settle into my new life. The apartment was cheap, spacious, and located in a historic building that had been converted into multiple units. Despite its age, it had a certain charm: wooden floors, high ceilings, and large windows that let in plenty of light. But from the moment I moved in, I began to feel a strange presence. It started: small shadows flickering out of the corner of my eye, things that seemed out of place when I looked closer. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination, the result of a long day of unpacking and adjusting to my new surroundings. It wasn't until the first night that I felt something was seriously wrong. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what had disturbed my sleep, but as I lay in the dark, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the floorboards. But then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I froze, holding my breath. My mind raced. Was it a neighbor? Or maybe a burglar? But the footsteps didn't sound like they were outside my door. They sounded closer, almost as if someone was standing just on the other side of the room, waiting. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:17 a.m., too early for anyone to be awake, and the building was usually silent at night. I slowly got out of bed, my footsteps silent on the wooden floors, and crept toward the door. I pressed my ear against it, straining to listen, but all I could hear was the soft ticking of the clock in the kitchen. I opened the door carefully, peering into the hallway. It was empty. Relieved, I turned back toward my room, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye: someone standing at the far end of the hallway. I blinked, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I rushed back into my room, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, and my hands shook as I tried to calm myself. It wasn't until the next morning, when I went to take a shower, that I noticed something strange. In the steam on the bathroom mirror was a message, scrawled in what looked like a handprint. Leave. I was horrified. The message was clear, and it felt personal, but who could have written it? I was alone in the apartment, and the door had been locked the entire night. I wiped the mirror clean, trying to convince myself it was just condensation, a trick of the steam. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The following nights became even worse. Every time I would go to bed, I would hear those footsteps again: slow, deliberate, pacing in the hallway. I tried leaving lights on, but the noises didn't stop. It was like something or someone was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. One night, as I was lying in bed, the footsteps started again, but this time, they were much closer. I held my breath as I heard them approach my bedroom door. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as the door handle turned slowly. But when I glanced toward the door, it was still locked. Then, to my horror, I heard the voice, soft, low, and unmistakably clear. "You're not welcome here." I screamed and bolted out of bed, running toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, the door swung open on its own. My heart skipped a beat as I stood frozen, staring into the empty hallway. I packed my things and left that night. I didn't look back. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that apartment. Maybe it was a ghost, or maybe it was something darker. I've never stayed in an old building since, and I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me. I was camping with a few friends deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest when we stumbled upon something we hadn't planned for a forgotten cabin that didn't show up on any map. The forest around us was dense, with towering trees that blocked most of the sunlight, casting long, dark shadows across the trail. We had been hiking for hours, lost in conversation, when we suddenly found ourselves in front of a small, run-down cabin. Its wooden walls were weathered, with moss growing on the roof and the windows covered in grime. The door hung loosely on its hinges, as if it hadn't been used in years. At first, we thought it was abandoned, a relic of the past left to rot in the forest. But something about it seemed off. There was an unsettling silence around the cabin, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The trees around it were unusually still, and the air felt heavier, thicker, as though the cabin was absorbing all the life around it. "We should check it out," my friend Dave said, ever the adventurer. "I bet there's something cool inside." Against my better judgment, I followed him and the others inside. The door creaked open, revealing a dark interior. The air smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. We all took hesitant steps inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The cabin had a single room, sparsely furnished with a rickety table and chairs. There was a fireplace at one end, but it hadn't been used in years. What caught my attention, however, was a small bookshelf in the corner, its shelves stacked with old, yellowed books and a few dusty trinkets. "Weird," I muttered, running my fingers along the spine of one of the books. "This place feels like it's been stuck in time." As we explored the cabin, we heard nothing but our own footsteps. It was unnervingly quiet, too quiet. We made our way upstairs, the old wooden staircase creaking under our weight. The second floor was even more eerie, with only one small room that seemed to have been used as a bedroom. There was a dusty mattress on the floor, and the walls were covered in strange, faded symbols, some of which I recognized as ancient runes. But there was something more disturbing, something that made my skin crawl. On the far wall, carved into the wood, were words written in that looked like fresh blood. "Leave now, or you will stay forever." I froze, staring at the message. The others hadn't noticed, but I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Hey, guys," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We should get out of here." But it was too late. As soon as the words left my mouth, the temperature in the room dropped, and the door to the cabin slammed shut behind us. I turned around, but there was no one outside. We were trapped. A low, guttural growl echoed from the corner of the room, followed by the sound of something moving, something large, something breathing heavily. We all spun around, our flashlights flickering as we pointed them toward the source of the noise. In the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at us, and in that moment, I knew we weren't alone. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. Whatever was in that cabin was ancient, and it was hungry. We scrambled to the stairs, but as I reached the first step, the floorboards beneath us began to tremble. The walls seemed to come alive, shifting and closing in. The growl grew louder, more menacing. It was coming closer. We couldn't leave fast enough. We managed to break down the door and escape, but as I looked back, I saw the glowing eyes watching us from the window, and then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished. We didn't speak for the rest of the hike. None of us dared to turn around as we made our way back to the trailhead. When we finally reached the main road, I glanced back one last time. The cabin was gone. There was nothing but the dense forest, as if it had never been there at all. We left that place behind, but I can still feel the weight of those eyes following me. The cabin may have vanished, but the memory of what we encountered there will never fade. It was supposed to be a peaceful day at the beach. Just my best friend Olivia and me, escaping the city for some relaxation. We had arrived at the beach just after sunrise, the sand untouched and the ocean calm. We set up our spot near the water, far from the crowds that usually populated the area. The morning fog was still thick, the kind that clung to everything, making the world feel distant and muted. We were having a great time at first, chatting, laughing, and soaking in the rare moment of peace. But as the hours passed, something about the beach began to feel strange. The fog grew heavier, and the light from the sun barely pierced through the mist. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore was almost drowned out by the strange silence in the air. Even the birds, which usually filled the sky, were gone. "Oh, Olivia, have you noticed anything odd?" I asked, scanning the beach. It was deserted, aside from us, and the feeling of isolation was beginning to unsettle me. "Yeah," she said, her voice low, "it's way too quiet." "This place feels like it's not real," I agreed. It felt like we were stuck in a dream, one that was slowly turning darker by the minute. We decided to walk along the shore, hoping the movement would shake off the strange feeling. As we walked, we noticed something unusual, a dark figure standing at the edge of the water, where the waves met the sand. At first, we thought it was just a rock or some driftwood, but as we got closer, we realized it was a person. A man, standing motionless, staring out at the ocean. "Who's that?" Olivia whispered, her voice filled with concern. "Why is he just standing there?" I didn't know. He hadn't moved, not even when we approached. As we got closer, I saw that his clothes rolled, tattered, and torn, as if he had been stranded there for years. His hair was matted, and his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. But it wasn't just his appearance that made my stomach churn, it was his eyes. They were completely white, with no iris or pupil, just an empty void. "Hello," I called out, but the man didn't respond. He just kept staring at the ocean. Suddenly, he turned his head toward us, his gaze piercing. And then, without warning, he began to walk toward us slowly, unnervingly slow, like a shadow gliding across the sand. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like he was dragging something behind him. We froze, unable to move, as the man drew closer, and then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone like a ghost swallowed by the fog. We didn't wait to find out what happened next. We turned and ran back to our spot on the beach, packed up our things in a panic, and left. To this day, I've never returned to that beach. The image of the man with the empty eyes haunts me, and I can't shake the feeling that there's something out there in the fog, waiting for its next visitor. It was a cold and foggy evening in the early spring, and I was driving back home after a long day at work. The highway was desolate, with only the occasional passing car breaking the otherwise unyielding darkness. The low, swirling fog seemed to stretch endlessly, making the night feel even more oppressive. As I neared the outskirts of town, I noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. It wasn't unusual to see hitchhikers on this stretch of highway, but what stood out to me was how the figure appeared to be standing perfectly still, as if frozen in time. The figure was a woman, wearing a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the season, and her hands were tucked into the pockets, her head lowered as if she were deep in thought. I slowed down, my headlights illuminating her pale face as I pulled up beside her. "Do you need a ride?" I called out through the window. She didn't immediately respond, and for a moment, I considered driving past her. But something about her presence felt different, something I couldn't place. Finally, she looked up, her eyes wide and filled with an intensity that made me hesitate. "I don't have much time," she said, her voice almost a whisper, as if she were speaking directly to me. "But I can help you." I wasn't sure what she meant by that, but I unlocked the passenger door. She opened it slowly and got in without a word, staring straight ahead as though she hadn't heard me speak. I looked at her from the corner of my eye, but didn't press her for conversation. We drove in silence for a while, The only sounds were the hum of the tires and the faint radio static in the background. I glanced at her occasionally, but she didn't seem to notice. The fog outside grew thicker, and the car felt colder, despite the heater being on full blast. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low and calm. "Don't go past the bridge. Not tonight." I turned to her, startled. "What do you mean, the bridge?" "It's the fastest route home." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward me slowly, her face now bathed in the dim glow of the dashboard light. Her eyes were locked onto mine with such intensity that it felt as though she could see right through me. "Don't," she repeated, her tone sharp now. "Turn around, go back." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I ignored it. After all, it was just a suggestion. One had taken this route hundreds of times before, and I was used to it. I couldn't see why one bridge would make any difference. But as I neared the bridge, something strange happened. The fog seemed to grow thicker, swirling around my car like a living thing, making it almost impossible to see the road ahead. My headlights flickered once, twice, before staying on. I looked over at her, ready to ask her why she was so insistent, but the passenger seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as I glanced around. There was no sign of her, no trace of the woman who had just been sitting beside me. The car was eerily silent, the fog pressing against the windows. I looked in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was empty as well. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I heard a faint sound like a whisper, almost inaudible, drifting through the fog. It was coming from the bridge. I didn't hesitate this time. My instinct screamed at me to turn around. I spun the wheel, reversing as fast as I could, until I was far enough from the bridge that the fog began to thin, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I didn't drive home that night. Instead, I found a small motel and stayed there until morning. I never went near that bridge again. Years later, I learned that a woman had died on that bridge many years ago, hit by a car while crossing. Some say she still lingers there, warning drivers who unknowingly approach, trying to save them from a fate like hers. I'm not sure what happened that night, but I'll never forget the feeling of her presence, or the warning she gave me. In 2014, my wife and I were driving cross-country, taking a much-needed vacation. We had been on the road for several days, and after hours of driving through endless desert highways, we finally reached a small town in southern Nevada. It was late, and we were both exhausted, so we pulled off the highway and found a roadside motel. The neon sign flickered above the door, casting an eerie glow across the parking lot. The clerk, an older man with a tired smile, handed us the key to room number 7. We didn't think much of it at first, just another night in a cheap motel before we got back on the road in the morning. But when we entered the room, something felt wrong. The air was thick, the temperature cold, and there was a heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere in the room. At first, we attributed it to the worn-out furnishings and the musty smell that seemed to permeate the space. But, as the night wore on, things began to get stranger. The TV in the corner flickered on and off by itself, the sound warbling like a radio, tuning in and out. I chalked it up to faulty wiring, but my wife noticed something else. The mirror above the dresser was cracked, the lines running in jagged patterns across the glass. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of the door handle rattling. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the motel settling, but the rattling continued, more persistent now, like someone was trying to get in. My wife was still fast asleep beside me, so I quietly got out of bed and checked the door. There was no one there, just the faint outline of the moonlight filtering through the blinds. I turned the deadbolt and returned to bed, trying to shake the unsettling feeling in my chest. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the room. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and for a long moment, everything was silent. Then, the door swung open on its own. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, but there was no one in the doorway. The room was completely empty. The air was still and cold, and the temperature seemed to have dropped even further. I stood frozen, not knowing whether to call the front desk or leave the motel altogether. But before I could move, I heard a voice low and rasping, coming from the corner of the room. "Leave before it's too late." I rushed to the door, grabbed my wife, and pulled her out of bed. We didn't even stop to gather our things. We bolted out of the room and into the parking lot, not stopping until we reached the safety of our car. I glanced back at the motel one last time and saw the figure of a man standing in the window, staring down at us with hollow eyes. We didn't return to the motel, and I haven't driven through that town since. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of the door rattling, the voice warning us to leave. If you made it this far, subscribe to Mr. Horror Stories for more terrifying true encounters, real-life mysteries, and unsolved nightmares. Thanks for watching.